Join us September 21st through the 23rd for the 2023 AMSN Annual Convention in fabulous Las Vegas, Nevada.
Double down on your commitment to our practice and to your patients by gathering with your peers and aspirational leaders for 3 days of learning and networking.
Don't miss the premier event for medical surgical nurses. Register now at amsn.org.
We'll see you in Vegas.
This is Maritess.
Neil.
And this is Laura. Welcome to MedSurg Moments, the AMSN podcast.
This podcast is an engaging look at the lives of and surrounding medical surgical nurses.
We're proud med-surg nurses, just like you, sharing our stories, insights, and experiences to support you in your nursing journey.
Well, our topic today is let's talk about MRSA. But before we get started, let's see what's new with everyone. Laura, why don't you start?
Well, not a whole lot new with me. I am in the middle of trying to landscape my backyard, learning about different kinds of mulch, so that's always fun. The weather's just been so beautiful. We've just really enjoyed being outside. Neil, anything with you?
A coworker of mine will be a mountain bike. I'm excited to get back outside and enjoy Mother Nature in a good way. Now I have to make a plan of where I want to take it to go enjoy some outside time in between class, possibly a good reset. Sometimes the gym's a good reset, but even better, the Mother Nature reset. How about you, Sam?
Not a lot new going on in my personal life, but I've been working on studying for my nursing professional development certification. So hopefully need to get that scheduled and finished up here soon. And at work lately, I've just been hosting some classes on restraint documentation. So something we all love and resonate with. I think that one hits home for everybody. But other than that, it's been pretty steady. How about you, Maritess? How's that vacation planning coming?
Well, that sounds exciting. The restraint competency. That's challenging and exciting. A lot of updates, but I'm very, very excited. We are all set with our dates. Our tours have been all planned out. We know where to go, who to meet. Hotels have been booked, and I'm very, very excited. One thing, though, my family members doesn't know yet. So almost there and very, very excited. So why don't we move on to our topic? Today's topic is one I suggested. Let's talk about MRSA. And I thought I'd start with a little background as to why I chose this topic. Well, I was talking to one of the newly graduate nurses in the unit. The nurse shared that she does not understand why her manager is over her and her MRSA patients. She's over the documentation, over the CHG bathing, over why she missed the MRSA history documentation. And she's very upset about it. She doesn't understand why this is such a huge concern. And I said, well, documentation, history, and all these are important for value-based care. But on the flip side, do you understand how this would affect your patients? And she was really very upset with it because she sees it as a huge punishment for her. She had to go through all the verbal counseling because she's always missing either the history or the CHG bath or delegating something to the CNA to make sure that care is done appropriately. And so that makes me really wonder. This is a very common infection. MRSA is so common here in the United States, but how much do we really know about MRSA? So I'm going to open that discussion. Laura, what are your thoughts?
I have had a lot of similar conversations with both new grads and existing staff who get a little frustrated because it almost feels like they're being micromanaged. But really, I think it is a lack of understanding of why it's so important. Yes, it is a part of, like you were talking about, the value-based purchasing and why our reimbursement is tied to how well we meet those measures. But it's more than that. It is about protecting the patients. It's about educating the patients on how to care for themselves when they have these infections and how they can spread and what we can do to treat them. It's not just any old antibiotic that patient has to get to treat a MRSA infection. So I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about why all of those measures are in place. Because, I mean, they can be cumbersome and they do take some time and it's easy to forget. But if we forget, that creates larger problems down the way.
I can tell you, I've had MRSA. I almost lost my right hand to MRSA. I had plucked the ingrown hair on my right hand, went to a public pool that wasn't chlorinated, and it's sitting there swelling up. I'm like, no, I'm good. I got some topical antibiotic for it. The second day of having it, I couldn't close my right hand. I was eating with my left hand. I had it soaking in a bucket of ice, and finally went to the ED and they popped it. They had a hand surgeon perform surgery on it to make sure I didn't sever a nerve or anything. And it took 2 days of antibiotics in the hospital and some small wound care. Now I'm going to always be linked as having MRSA.
Wow, Neil, that's super scary. I remember caring for a patient once who was probably pretty close to my age, like mid-late 20s, somewhere in there. And she had popped a zit on her face and ended up with a MRSA abscess in her cheek or chin area. It's pretty shocking to everybody. Like, holy moly, how did that even happen? With just popping a pimple, you wouldn't even think twice about doing that most of the time. And she ended up with a really devastating infection. So I'm thankful you got to keep your hand, Neil.
Yeah, so it was quite a scary experience. I could have possibly applied for some kind of scholarship for a left-handed nurse or something, maybe for a one-handed nurse scholarship. I was very stubborn. I learned now never to overlook signs and symptoms of infection, ever, ever, ever.
Yeah, because you're very lucky that it didn't get into your bone. That's when you start losing limbs.
Average cost of MRSA in a hospital stay is about $14,000. And this is from AHRQ. And so probably this is something like, okay, well, you know what? This is a hospital cost. This is a patient cost. And this is the reason why this is part of the value-based care. But again, can you imagine all the consequences that can happen to a patient, complications, just like what you're sharing, Neil and Laura, you're sharing about the bone infection. What we really can do is do our magic hand washing, which has been in our national patient safety goals for how many years? I don't know. I can't count anymore.
Since the beginning.
I agree. It's all about that hand washing, and that can prevent a lot of things.
The other thing we can talk about with MRSA is isolation precautions. When you've got somebody with an active infection and you've got to get gowned up, masked up, gloved up before you walk in that room, even if you're doing something simple like stopping the pump from beeping, it's easy to spread. So it's important to take those precautions. If the patient is on contact isolation, we have to take those things seriously. We have to do it across the board, and we have to be diligent about it.
Yeah, that's one thing with those signage. You got to make sure that that's in the patient's door and to make sure that you really clean the surfaces. Another thing that I wanted to share is to share that information to the patient, because the patient may be discharged and they really didn't know what to do when they're at home. To Neil's point, being very diligent with cleaning surfaces, high surfaces in the home to prevent the spread of infection.
MRSA is out there in the world. So if you've got a cut on your hand or if you've got an open spot, you're at risk. So it's important to try to keep cuts covered. Watch for it on your children. Watch for it on your family members. It can easily happen to any of us.
I definitely have become, I don't say germaphobe, I've become germ aware. I glove up. It sounds crazy to even ambulate a patient to the bathroom. If I'm going to stand by a system, I glove up. Even working on my truck, I glove up. Like you said, the world's a dirty place.
I always have a 70% alcohol in my pocket all the time, like a spray. And so when the pandemic happened, it's kind of like a habit already. And so my coworkers would always say, oh, look, we know who has the 70% alcohol in her pocket. It's Maritess. Grab it, because it's so true. Not that you're afraid of having an infection, but the germs are everywhere. You'll never know who has it. And so as a nurse, you really need to protect yourself, because if you protect yourself, you protect your family when you go home.
I think the other perspective that we could give on this conversation about MRSA is also talking about antibiotic stewardship and helping prevent these antibiotic resistant organisms from forming, things like MRSA. And there's always great opportunities to partner with providers or pharmacists and talk about patient cases and infections, and do we have cultures back, and can we narrow down their antibiotics? Patient education is huge too when we're sending people home with antibiotics, generally making sure that they are going to take every single last dose of what they are prescribed, and hopefully helping prevent these types of things from emerging, whether they're new bugs or ones that are existing.
That is a great point. I feel like there's a lot of misunderstanding out there about why it's important to take that full dose of antibiotics. It's almost like they're in a boxing match and all you're doing is knocking the bug out, but you're not killing the bug. So they come back stronger. So if you take all of the antibiotics, you're in essence killing the bug, so they can't come back.
I feel like I had such great opportunities to partner with the clinical pharmacist that worked primarily on my unit back when I was bedside. And I learned so much information from her, and we were able to communicate effectively together, whether it was her with the provider or me or whoever, just to get the best care for our patients and their infections.
We're all guilty of, I start feeling better, where you see like the swelling going down, taking the antibiotics. So you naturally think you don't need to take this anymore, not realizing you just kind of knock it out. And so hence you get the resistance, that predicament that we're in.
I'm definitely guilty of that with a recent ear infection. It's also just so inconvenient. I don't have time to lay down for 5 minutes for ear drops. But we got that taken care of. Don't worry about my ear, guys. It's okay.
I had to put an alarm on my phone when I was taking antibiotics. At some point, I had to put an alarm and make sure I take it, because first of all, I don't want to take it. That's one. But also, I need to take it to make sure that I do the complete dose. One thing that I wanted to share, though, if you have long fingernails or you have acrylic nails too, that can also harbor microorganisms or bacteria under your nails. Your jewelry as well. You're not wearing any jewelry, because that can also have some germs in it. So just a friendly reminder.
What do you guys think about if you saw a colleague who maybe wasn't following precautions very strictly with a patient who has MRSA?
That's a good question, or that's a good point to make. It's difficult to say something. I mentioned earlier about the pumps that are beeping. You don't want to get all gowned and gloved up to run in there and go stop that pump from beeping. But it's important. It's important to speak up and say, hey, I noticed you didn't gown and glove before you walked in that room. We all need to be taking care of our patients. Say something. I can remember as a leader having to do audits on my staff, and I can't tell you how many times I heard that. Well, I'm just going in there to stop the pump from beeping. And it's like, it's not good enough. The risk is too high. We've got to take the time to put on our gloves, to put on our gown before we go in there. Try to cluster our care, do what we can to minimize how often we have to go through that gowning and gloving procedure. It's time consuming and it's hot sometimes, and it's easier just to run in and hit that button. But we're putting the patient at risk, but we're also putting ourselves at risk, and we're putting our other patients at risk as well. So when you understand the reason why, it makes it a little bit easier to comply with the rules.
I started out as a CNA on an oncology unit. So the importance of it was so emphasized to us in our orientation that literally you can kill this patient by not washing your hands. Especially, you have an oncology patient that's at nadir, so they're at their lowest point, and you can walk in and just haphazardly set off a chain of events that can be their demise.
And I really think it is so important to understand all the whys, all the stories that we're sharing here. Neil, your personal stories that you're sharing, we all need to learn from it. The why behind everything. Laura, I like that you share that, because at the end of the day, there are a lot of programs out there. The government has provided us with all these guidelines and protocols on how to prevent MRSA, how to treat MRSA. But you got to think of yourself. Why is it that we put so much importance with the prevention, with the management of MRSA patients, because this is a community problem. It could be a hospital-acquired infection, absolutely, but community-wise as well. When we go to the grocery or we go to public places, we can get them. And so understanding the whys behind why do we need to wash our hands? Why do we need to do a CHG bath for our patients? Why do we need to make sure that the patients do have appropriate antibiotics when they are in the hospital? This is not just taking care of the patient, but this is also for our protection, for the protection of the community that we live in. It's so important that we understand that. That's why it's called PPE, personal protective equipment. You are protecting yourself. The why behind it would really drill down to, I cannot make any shortcuts. I will make sure that I take my antibiotics. And as a nurse, I need to make sure that I am protecting myself. So I'm protecting the community.
Honestly, I look back sometimes on my teaching career, and that was pre-hand sanitizer for everything. That was from like 98 to like the mid 2000s. So that was before every mom had the hand sanitizer on her keychain. And I just think about who knows what I probably walked in and out of that classroom at the end of the day, especially a second grade classroom where it's just all hands and noses and all kinds of infectious stuff. I look back now, I'm like, no wonder I have this great immune system. Between teaching and nursing, I've probably been exposed to everything.
Yeah, but I think we also need to do some education about that sanitizer. It has its uses, absolutely. And I think we're better off for having it out there. But like before you eat, we need to use soap and water. After you use the bathroom, we need to use soap and water. They're not good enough for that.
It never fails. The one time that you did use hand sanitizer before eating, you accidentally lick your finger and then regret it.
Yeah, exactly. Screening our patients appropriately when they're admitted. Going back to the beginning, if we can get these patients identified from the beginning, we can be sure to put all of these protocols in place. If they have a Foley catheter or a central line, we have to be extra diligent about the care we provide to those devices, because if they're already colonized with MRSA and then we're not taking all the appropriate steps to care for those lines, we're opening them up to another infection.
And I think, Laura, it's also so important to partner with your infection prevention team. If you have doubts or if you have questions, if there's something that you really don't understand, it's so important that you partner with the experts in your hospital. And that would be your infection prevention team, your risk management team as well, and the quality team who are knowledgeable with the other things that we can do to prevent MRSA infection in the hospital.
And honestly, I think in every facility I've ever worked at, the infection prevention team, those nurses are awesome. And they would love for you to call them with any questions. They've always been very, very helpful and always willing to come and talk with you or answer any questions. So do not be afraid to reach out to them. Those nurses have a lot of knowledge that they would love to share with you.
Well, we know that MRSA comes in different forms, comes in different appearances. Sometimes a sore doesn't really look like a spider bite or like a swollen infection, but it could be MRSA. So how do we really know that this is a MRSA infection?
I think it can be really important to advocate early for culturing any wounds or doing blood cultures, things like that, just to be sure that we kind of know what type of bug that we're dealing with for whatever infection our patient is presenting with. And again, being good stewards of our antibiotics and making sure that they are getting the most appropriate treatment for that infection, whether it's MRSA or something else. But yeah, I think getting those cultures done early, especially before we initiate antibiotics, is really critical and something that we can play a big part in doing.
Yes, absolutely. We do have to watch for other signs and symptoms that maybe weren't outwardly presenting as MRSA. If they came in for a broken bone or they were in an accident or something, if we're not keeping an eye on little sores or scratches, and if we don't do a good thorough inspection on admission, and then later on that cut becomes infected, we could be talking about a MRSA infection.
And I think that's where the first point of contact is so important. When you ask the patient, did you have a MRSA infection in the past? And they say, I do not know. Or they would say, yes, I had a MRSA infection a year ago. They still count as someone that we need to swab and make sure that we do a MRSA swab, because MRSA doesn't really present in a specific form. It could be a simple cut. It could be a simple bug bite, it's so important that there's communication with the patient. When you're taking your medical history, when you had a bug bite, did you go to the woods, the forest? What are the things that you have done? And so that would really help with history taking. Also, it's so important that the blood cultures and the swabbing and the medications that a patient is taking, because that can also correlate to maybe this person had been resistant to antibiotics for at some point. So history taking is important.
Yeah. And the other thing is infections that are not related to their presenting diagnosis. If they came in for something relatively benign and all of a sudden they start running fevers, we have to start looking for other places. And I know that ICU patients are at risk of MRSA for ventilated patients. So when they transfer out of the ICU, we could be looking at later signs, maybe not signs that were presented at that particular time. But when they transfer out of the ICU, now all of a sudden they're showing symptoms. So it's important to be diligent and keep an eye on those kinds of things. A lot of people have poor oral care, and we know that gums are wide open for infections in our mouths. So we have to think about that too.
Well, believe it or not, we're just about out of time. But before we go, let's quickly summarize what we've learned. Hand washing can prevent multiple of things. Take every precaution when working with MRSA patients. Don't let your guard down. When you protect yourself, you protect your family when you go home. Educate the MRSA patient before they are discharged regarding what they need to do when they get home. Take care of all cuts and superficial wounds. Advocate for the importance of taking every dose of antibiotic in the prescription. Don't forget, long fingernails and jewelry can harbor germs and microorganisms. Finally, if you see a colleague being non-compliant with their PPE or other precautions with MRSA patients, say something. If you don't, you're putting yourself and your colleagues and patients at risk. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.
We look forward to connecting with you on the next episode of MedSurg Moments, the AMSN podcast. In the meantime, we want to hear from you. Send us your questions, topic ideas, and feedback via our official MedSurg Moments email address, amsnpod@amsn.org. That's amsnpod@amsn.org.
Please be sure to leave us a review and recommend MedSurg Moments wherever you get your podcasts to help us reach even more listeners.
The content within the MedSurg Moments podcast represents the views, thoughts, and opinions of the co-hosts, may not necessarily reflect the views, thoughts, and opinions of the Academy of Medical Surgical Nurses.
Until next time, this is Laura.
Neil.
And this is Maritess. And always remember, MedSurg Moments is a moment in our lives, a moment in our MedSurg careers that makes a huge difference.